In the shadowed halls of medieval castles and the incense-filled chambers of churches, a powerful myth took root: the myth of virginity. To understand the medieval obsession with a woman's sexual purity, we must step into a world governed by religious doctrine, rigid gender roles, and political power masked as morality. The Virgin Mary became the paragon of ideal femininity, pure, obedient, untouched. The closer a woman could align herself with this ideal, the more virtuous she was considered. Sexuality, on the other hand, was seen as dangerous. Lust was sin. Female desire was a threat. And so, virginity became the ultimate virtue, the gatekeeper of morality and marriage alike. Midwives were often summoned to conduct virginity tests before weddings. They would inspect the girl's genitals and behavior, deciding her fate based on dubious signs: tightness, trembling, or simply the absence of resistance. Virginity wasn't just a physical state. It was a symbol of family honor, divine favor, and patriarchal control. A man's honor was tied to the chastity of his wife. Kings would annul marriages if the bride was used. Knights would kill for the suggestion that their beloved was not pure. Entire wars were justified by allegations of defilement. It wasn't about love or lust, it was about control. After consummation, the blood-stained sheet would often be displayed to relatives or even hung out of a window for neighbors to see. A successful display meant honor, family pride, and the social legitimacy of the marriage. The hymen, so often misunderstood, is not a sealed curtain that breaks only with penetration. It varies greatly between individuals. Some are born with very little hymenal tissue, some lose it through activities like riding horses or climbing trees, and others retain it even after intercourse. A lack of blood, however, could lead to accusations of impurity, deceit, or even infidelity. A curious mind or open laughter could be seen as suspicious. A panel of midwives or old women considered experts would examine the bride's body to look for signs of previous sexual activity. These included hymenal condition, vaginal tightness, and physical signs of supposed moral decay: stretch marks, loose hips, or even calloused hands. In some cases, slaughtered animals were smuggled into the room beforehand to provide a more convincing effect. Some were divorced immediately after the wedding. Others were subjected to shameful parades or confined to convents in disgrace, their only crime not performing the expected biology. Recipes varied. Some involved vinegar-soaked sponges, herbal compresses, or tight bindings designed to create swelling and pain during intercourse, thus mimicking the effects of first-time sex. These were dangerous and painful, yet sometimes effective in faking the theatrical experience expected by grooms and families. This wasn't done out of malice. It was pure survival. Some of these were con artists, while others performed crude procedures attempting to recreate a hymenal membrane using stitches or scar tissue. In royal courts, especially in France and England, brides of noble birth were sometimes observed by witnesses during the consummation. Itself, a horrifying violation of privacy turned into a legal necessity. Kings and nobles wanted proof, and proof required witnesses. A marriage unconsummated due to lack of virginity could be annulled, ruining political alliances and dynastic plans. These operations were rarely safe, often unsuccessful, and left women physically and emotionally scarred. And the shame was hers to carry, regardless of biology or truth. A woman who failed this bloody test might be disowned, imprisoned, or cast out. Young brides would panic if they failed to bleed on their wedding night. Some resorted to extreme measures, from pricking their fingers to killing animals and smearing the bedsheets with blood, just to meet expectations. And that made women desperate and creative. Others were forced into celibacy by their families, who feared the shame of a scandal more than the suffering of a daughter. Virginity was no longer a choice. It was a burden passed down like a curse. Others faced public trials, humiliations, or brutal punishments for failing an impossible test. The virginity of the bride wasn't just assumed, it had to be demonstrated, witnessed, even certified. And for many, that meant one thing above all: blood on the bedsheets. The examiner would insert fingers into the vagina and assess its tightness. A completely unreliable and traumatic procedure rooted in myth, not medicine. Many girls endured this violation in silence, hoping it would prove what society demanded. Girls were taught that their worth began and ended between their legs. It was commodified, glorified, and demanded, often at the expense of truth and autonomy. The origins of this obsession can be traced to a blend of religious teachings and Greco-Roman values repackaged by Christian ideology. For noble families, ensuring a daughter's virginity was not just about piety, it was political strategy. A virgin bride was currency. She could secure alliances, lands, and titles. The stakes were high, and so were the expectations. A woman who failed to prove her purity risked more than social shame. She could be cast out, imprisoned, or even executed. But what did proving virginity actually mean in the Middle Ages? That's where things turned strange and disturbingly theatrical. Across Europe, different cultures devised increasingly bizarre and invasive tests. A show to reassure the groom, the family, the community, even if it was based on deception. The morning after the wedding, sheets were publicly displayed. If they were stained with blood, the bride was declared pure. If not, her entire future was on the line. The hymen, a piece of skin, was misunderstood as a guarantee. Yet, as modern science confirms, the hymen is no reliable indicator of virginity. It can stretch, tear, or remain intact through various activities unrelated to sex. But medieval people didn't know that. Or perhaps they didn't care. What mattered was performance. Theater, blood on the sheets. This obsession infiltrated medicine too. So-called physicians devised grotesque techniques to examine girls' bodies in the name of truth. For women, virginity became a prison. It dictated how they dressed, how they spoke, even how they walked. A shy, modest demeanor was praised. This created a culture of surveillance and fear. But virginity was not just about women. Men, too, were complicit in this theater. This cult of virginity ran so deep that it became ritualized, even sanctified. Some noble women went to monasteries to preserve their purity for God. In medieval society, the night of a wedding was not just a private celebration. It was a public event with deeply disturbing rituals. This custom, known in many parts of Europe, turned the wedding night into a spectacle. But what if the bride didn't bleed? As we now understand, not all women bleed during first intercourse, yet in medieval minds, no blood meant no virginity. One popular trick involved pricking a finger or thigh and secretly staining the sheets with one's own blood. In extreme cases, she might face trial. In Germany and parts of Italy, a virginity tribunal could be formed by the groom's family. None of these had any scientific basis. But perhaps the most brutal method of all was the two-finger test, a practice that continued in various parts of the world well into the 20th century. And then there were the stories of false accusations. Women who were in fact virgins but failed to bleed or failed to pass the arbitrary inspections. To counter this cruel system, some women turned to folk remedies and secret potions believed to restore or simulate virginity. There were also doctors for hire, often traveling surgeons or apothecaries, who promised to restore virginity. The obsession didn't stop at marriage. All of this stemmed from a singular, powerful myth that a woman's moral worth was defined by what she had or hadn't done with her body. But not every woman accepted these terms. If society expected blood, they provided blood. If hymens were the currency of marriage, they forged it. In medieval Spain, it was common practice for newlyweds to be inspected for evidence of consummation. In parts of France, midwives taught young brides to tense their pelvic muscles, cry out in pain, and pretend fear during intercourse, not to please their husband, but to convince everyone she was untouched. One German manual from the 15th century even suggested sewing a thin layer of calfskin into the vaginal wall. These operations were dangerous, often infected, and occasionally fatal, but they were also in demand. Virginity became a performance, not a condition. Success was measured in believable agony. Enraged, he annulled the marriage and sent her to a convent. No bleeding sheet, no midwife inspection, no fear of annulment. A girl who surrendered her chastity, willingly or not, was seen as damaged, defiled, or even demonic. Some women, desperate to escape marriage or recover their honor, took vows of chastity and entered religious life. Nuns were required to remain brides of Christ, untouched and pure forever. Historical records tell of numerous scandals involving priests, monks, and even bishops who violated the very purity they preached. Nuns became pregnant. Monks fathered children, but the burden of blame always fell on the woman. If a nun gave birth, she was accused of seducing the man, even if she had no choice. She might be executed, buried alive in some cases, while the priest was merely reassigned. But the standards weren't just spiritual. In many cases, older nuns or abbesses would inspect younger women, ensuring they remained physically intact. She was imprisoned for life. He remained in office until his death, his reputation untarnished. These inspections were humiliating and invasive, not unlike the so-called virginity tests outside the church. Others were forced into nunneries by their families after a scandal, pregnancy, rape, or simply being caught alone with a man. These cloisters were not always safe havens. Some were prisons of silence where women lived in shame, exiled from the world for sins often beyond their control. There were no male virgin saints, no demands for proof, no hymens to inspect. The male body was never a site of judgment. Only women were expected to bleed for holiness. In one grotesque case, a nun's body was displayed post-mortem, and her hymen was said to be miraculously intact. This was taken as divine proof of her saintliness. These tales were told not as spiritual inspiration, but as sexual cautionary stories meant to terrify girls into submission, and judge their souls by what they had or hadn't done with their bodies. But even this had a twist. Months later, it was revealed that he, too, had lied about his own purity, having fathered 2 illegitimate children. From the pulpit to the parchment, religious leaders reinforced the idea that a woman's body was either a sacred vessel or a filthy temptation, with no middle ground. She wasn't just pure, she was immaculately, eternally untouched. In her, the church found the perfect woman, silent, obedient, and miraculously a mother without ever having sex. Mary became the model, the myth, and the moral trap. Every girl was told to emulate her, not just in virtue, but in bodily innocence. Regardless of the truth, these virginity spells often involved amulets, night rituals, and blood sacrifices. Whether they worked or not is unknown, but belief in them was strong enough to land many women in trouble with the Inquisition. For them, deception wasn't a sin, it was justice. The very institutions that claimed to value truth and morality drove countless women into deceit, not out of malice, but out of sheer survival. One recorded case from 14th century Valencia describes a bride who had a goat slaughtered and smeared its blood across the bed just before sunrise. It worked. Her honor and life was preserved. Behind the locked doors of medieval bedchambers, countless women became tricksters, using every method at their disposal to simulate purity, not because they were deceitful, but because the system left them no other choice. Herbal tampons soaked in vinegar or alum caused swelling and dryness, mimicking tightness during sex. In Italy, a mixture of powdered myrtle, wool, and resin was sometimes inserted a few hours before the wedding night. Though extremely painful, it created the illusion of rupture and blood. Let's start with one of the most famous stories of deception: the false, bloody sheet. But not all deception was bloody. Some tricks were physical and theatrical. Others took this performance a step further, using objects inserted beforehand to simulate tightness or induce bleeding. In wealthier circles, some women turned to surgeons or apothecaries for more extreme measures. In one 13th century tale from Flanders, a nobleman discovered his bride had faked the bloody sheet with sheep's blood. This exposes the double standard. Men were not held to the same test. If the obsession with virginity was a cultural fire, then the medieval church was the one pouring oil onto the flames. The most powerful symbol of all was the Virgin Mary. To be a virgin was to be holy. To lose virginity outside of marriage, however, was to fall from grace. Monasteries and convents became places of both refuge and punishment. Inside these walls, virginity was both weapon and chain. But even within the cloistered life, hypocrisy thrived, where a bishop maintained a secret relationship with a young nun under his supervision. The Church's doctrine on virginity extended even to death. This shows the tragic irony. Religion turned virginity into sacred flesh, something to be guarded, tested, idolized, even in death. And still, the Church remained silent on male chastity. But in some corners of Europe, cracks began to form in this moral empire. Still, the damage was deep. For centuries, the Church held up the idea that a pure woman was closer to God. The Middle Ages may be long gone, but the myth of virginity never truly died. It simply evolved, changing its language, modernizing its methods, and cloaking itself in new forms of control. Today, we may no longer hang bloodied sheets from windows, But the echoes of that ancient obsession still shape our culture, our medicine, our relationships, and especially how we treat women. Blood-stained sheets are still demanded by in-laws. Fake hymen kits are sold online. Surgeries to restore virginity, known as hymenoplasties, have become a booming business. In some cities, clinics perform hundreds of these operations every year. In cases of sexual assault, a victim's sexual history is often brought up in court, as if past consent invalidates present refusal. A woman who is not a virgin is sometimes seen as less credible, less harmed, less worthy of justice. Campaigns to ban virginity testing have gained traction in multiple countries. Young women are reclaiming their narratives, refusing to be defined by a status that doesn't even exist. Medically, writers and scholars are uncovering the hidden histories of deception, survival, and rebellion, not to shame the past, but to learn from it. Today, it remains a phantom currency, less visible but still deeply felt. This echoes the medieval idea that a woman who has had sex, even unwillingly, is somehow tainted. But the questions remain, and it's time we answered them with knowledge, empathy, and honesty. Just like their medieval counterparts, modern women turn to deception not out of vice, but out of necessity, because the punishment for honesty remains far too high. The virginity obsession was never really about sex. It was about power. Who has it, who loses it, and who gets to define it? It is not a mark of virtue. It is not anyone's business but your own. Modern science has thoroughly debunked the idea that virginity is a measurable biological state. We have the power to expose the myths, to end the rituals, and to speak the truths that were once whispered behind locked doors. The hymen is no more a seal of purity than a fingerprint is proof of innocence. It is a story, told to control, to shame, to manipulate. And like all stories, it can be rewritten. Female characters are often defined by when and how they lose it, while male characters are rarely burdened with the same scrutiny. The double standard persists. The shame persists. And yet, around the world, girls are still subjected to virginity tests, from military examinations in some countries to school inspections in others. Girls are still taught, subtly or overtly, that their worth is tied to their sexual history. Terms like pure, deflowered, or saving oneself carry the residue of centuries-old ideologies. Abstinence pledges, purity rings, and virginity balls are all contemporary echoes of a medieval mindset, one that teaches girls to see their bodies not as their own, but as vessels of honor for someone else. These tests are medically meaningless, psychologically damaging, and ethically condemned by the World Health Organization. But they persist, driven by the same fear, control, and honor-based systems that haunted medieval Europe. In some cultures, a girl's entire future still hinges on whether she bleeds on her wedding night. And in the West, where virginity is no longer a legal matter, it remains a powerful social myth. Even popular media plays its part. Films and books still treat virginity as a plot device, something to lose, steal, trade, or guard. What's more disturbing is how the legal system can still reflect this outdated thinking. And yet, amidst this darkness, resistance grows. Around the world, activists, educators, and survivors are challenging the virginity myth at every level. The truth is simple. Virginity is a social construct, not a medical fact. We must ask, who benefits from this myth? Who profits when women are taught to see their value in blood, silence, and obedience? In the medieval world, virginity was currency. It bought marriage, status, survival. The good news, we are no longer bound by these stories. The medieval bedchamber may be gone. The bloody sheets may have been burned. Virginity is not a test to pass, and perhaps, when we finally let go of the obsession, we can begin to see women not as bodies to be judged, but as lives to be lived.